All right. Hello there, my name's Holly Thorpe. I'm a professor at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. And it's my pleasure to be speaking to you today about action sports for development and peace and the power and the potential in these more informal activities for meeting development purposes. And it's a shame I can't be there with you today, but welcome to my office. My home here. We're in lockdown in New Zealand, so welcome, and hopefully there's something of interest for you here today. And if not, then please do reach out via email and continue this conversation. So today I want to provide a brief overview of what are action sports. What is action sports for development and peace? What is ASDP? I want to then focus on three kind of key areas where I think, and my research has shown, that action sports, these more informal recreational activities, can make a valuable and original contribution to development. So action sports and the environment, our understandings of environmentalism and some of the interesting work that's been done in that space, action sports and recovery and the potential for facilitating recovery from trauma in places of conflict and post-disaster, and also action sports for gender development. And then I just want to finish off with some of my research in this area and also signpost some possible future directions. So what are action sports? I think we all kind of know it. We have, particularly those who are studying action sports, we implicitly know there's something different in these sports. These are typically, there's been lots of different terms we've used. We've used lifestyle sports, extreme sports. In France for some time it was called whiz sports, alternative sports. But today I'm using the word action sports. And these are activities such as surfing, skateboarding, snowboarding, BMX, mountain biking, parkour. And these activities continue to develop quickly. And it's the history in these sports sometimes that helps us understand what makes them distinctive today, because some of these values that emerged from their histories in the 1960s and 1970s continue in elements of these cultures today. So when these sports developed, or these activities developed, it was often in distinction to or in contrast to the parent culture. They were often developed by young people who were trying to distinguish themselves, and in contrast also to more organised, traditional, competitive sports. They were trying to find something that was more playful, a space for self-expression. They embraced do-it-yourself and countercultural kind of ethos at the time. And many of these elements are there still within these sports today. However, here we go. These are some of the key values that we might think of in the early sports or action sports. Anti-establishment, countercultural values, individualistic. Participation in the early days was mostly informal, unregulated, often unstructured, non-competitive. Often there's a general sense or absence of rules and structures. There's a real value for self-expression and creativity. There was quite a strong dependence on the natural or the built environment. And in the early days, in some contexts, girls and boys, men and women were participating alongside one another. So quite different from more traditional sports, which were created by men for men. Though, over the past 30, 40 years, we've seen rapid growth, commercialisation, institutionalisation, and professionalisation of these sports. And in fact, these have been these changes in these sports at the local, national, and international level have been a big focus of my research over the past decade and a half. And it's as part of that research, I've been working with my colleague, Professor Belinda Wheaton, and we've been exploring the inclusion more and more of these sports into the Olympic Games. And I'm sure many of you will know that in Tokyo 2020 this year, we were supposed to have surfing, skateboarding, and sport climbing included in the Olympics. That'll now be Tokyo 2021. But this does mark quite a significant shift. So we've had action sports included in the Olympics in the past, snowboarding, freestyle skiing, mountain biking, BMX, windsurfing. But the inclusion of these sports is a really quite an important and significant sign that mainstream sports organisations recognise the power in these sports to bring in younger viewers and to excite audiences again. So we'll be watching that very, very carefully. And as I'm sure some of you may also know, in Paris 2024, we're also going to see breakdancing. So some pretty interesting trends going on within action sports as a result of these kinds of processes of incorporation, of institutionalization. And here are a couple of images, mocked up images of what people thought surfing, skateboarding and sport climbing might look like in Tokyo. And also one of the big pushes there in terms of bringing these sports into the Olympics was around women's participation, gender equity at the Olympics. So we are going to see women in these sports much more visible probably than they've ever been before. And also hopefully these sports will bring more diversity to the Olympics, although the jury's still out on that one. But very much these have been some of the trends that have been the focus of my research for some time. So as I mentioned, these sports are growing very quickly. And to really understand these sports, we do need to look back into their unique histories and these distinctive value systems that are held by participants still today. Many of these action sports, they're very closely connected with technological innovations as well as fashion, youth culture, music and celebrity culture. So there's a lot of intersection and overlapping in these youth cultural spaces. And as I mentioned before, some of these sports have quite unique gendered histories, with men and women participating alongside one another. It's not to say women weren't marginalised in many different ways and continue to be, but the gendered histories are quite different from more traditional organised sports. And the thing is, with these activities, they're quickly evolving and transforming, and actually progression is at the core of these activities. So one of the trends that I've been really interested in studying over the past 10 years or so, because often the stereotypes with participants in these sports were that they were young, white, wealthy males who were only kind of worried about themselves and their own pleasure seeking. But over the last decade or so, we've really seen what I've termed action sports for development and peace, or this growing momentum, this movement of participants in these activities, recognising the potential in surfing, skateboarding, climbing, parkour, in these informal activities for development purposes. And so I developed the website ASDP, Action Sports for Development and Peace, which you can see the website at the bottom there. And this was really about trying to bring this community together. This was established a few years ago now, and it was very much when I saw more and more of these kinds of action sports for development organisations popping up in lots of different isolated parts around the world, and I wasn't seeing a lot of dialogue going on at the time. I was seeing as a researcher commonalities in some of the issues that they were being experienced across the sector, but I wasn't seeing a lot of conversation. This is often because some of these organisations are working in quite isolated parts of the world. When they do talk, they might talk to someone or a group that's working in a similar sport or the same sport as themselves, not recognising that there might be commonalities between a surfing for development organisation and a skateboarding for development organisation. But what are the differences, what are the similarities? And this website was really about trying to bring this community together so that we could learn from one another, that organisations could learn from one another. And so on this website, on the front page, I underwent with my PhD student, now Dr. Nida Ahmed, and we mapped out as many action sports for development and peace organisations that we could. And so this on the website is an interactive map. So if you're only interested in the skateboarding for development type organisations, you can click on skateboarding. You might be just focused on those who are interested in youth, and you'll see where in the world those organisations are, and you can click on the little icon and that will take you to some information about that website as well as that organisation's own website. And so this was a big process of trying to map out the action sports for development sector and trying to have these conversations with all these organisations who are featured on this map. So this was our efforts to start these conversations and bring these organisations together as a community. And one of the other things here, as well as trying to share resources and the latest research and videos, we also set up Over the Gap, which is basically stories from behind the scenes, those that are working in this sector, because often we don't hear about those. Often the stories we get are from those that are the leaders or the visionaries of these organisations, or some of their key participants. Oh, but there are many, many volunteers and staff and people who travel around the world, or local staff as well, who do really important work in terms of actually making these programs happen. And so we've really, between Nita and I, we worked really hard to create regular stories, articles about some of the people working behind the scenes. So these are some of the articles you can see there. You click on the link and you can read more about Sophie Friedel and her work with skateboarding in Afghanistan and in Europe. You can read about the Jerusalem Skater Girls or Skateworks, what they're doing with Aboriginal communities in Australia. We had a whole 5-part series on women working behind the scenes in surfing NGOs for women and girls development. And so yeah, there's a lot on this website, so please do take the opportunity to check it out, to see what the website offers in terms of mapping out action sports development and peace, what organisations are out there, the key areas that they're working in, because there's still a lot of work we need to do, but hopefully this website is one stepping stone towards facilitating these conversations. And so through my research, I've been really for a long time asking the question, what is distinctive about these activities? What do they offer development that is different from, say, soccer or basketball, right? And one of them really is that achievement is not based on winning. It might be paddling on a surfboard for the first time, or jumping up on the surfboard for the first time, or just standing on a skateboard and just rolling along, right? Or it might be learning how to do your first ollie. And your success or sense of achievement is not based on beating another team, right? Or beating an opponent. And that's a very valuable aspect of these activities, I believe. Particularly when we're talking about young people or communities in contexts of conflict or post-trauma, competing, beating others may not necessarily be the most helpful type of activity in those kinds of environments. These activities also have, and they can have if they're well facilitated, unique social dynamics, where people of different age groups, different ability levels, different genders can participate together and sharing a space, learning the rules and norms about sharing a space, respecting difference, can be really, really valuable. Another point of distinction is often that they're not so hierarchically organised, where you have a coach with knowledge who is imparting that among the learners. Rather, it's much more peer mentoring and self-regulation that goes on in these spaces. And peer mentoring can be a really valuable thing, particularly in communities of development. And another key point really is this learning through play, where these activities value self-expression, creativity, the interpretation of spaces and environments in different ways, moving the bodies freely. We don't have marked out barriers or time zones in terms of how long you play for and what lines you must play within. It's very much about expressing oneself within a space, and through movement, of course. And through these activities, there's quite a lot of potential for community building, and I'll talk about this soon, as well as what I believe another key point or factor with these activities is their unique relationships with the natural and the built environment. And that's the first point that I want to kind of launch off right now. and particularly this relationship between action sports and environmentalism. And this is a topic that's been gaining a lot more sort of academic attention as well. So various researchers have discussed the close relationship between action sport participants and the natural environment, and how it can lead to heightened, what Olive calls, an ecological sensibilities, or what Breimer and Oates refer to as ecocentricity. So through our immersive, close relationships with the natural environment, some researchers and some participants are saying this can lead to sort of heightened environmental considerations. But as Belinda Wheaton has correctly pointed out, action sport participants are individualistic and they're part of a collectivity. They are hedonistic and reflexive consumers, and often politically disengaged, yet environmentally aware and or active. And she was writing this in 2007, and I think we've almost seen these contradictions bubble up to the surface even more in this current moment, where environmental crisis is really much more pressing than it was 10, 15 years ago. And so we're definitely seeing more and more of these action sports communities rallying together around environmental issues. And there's a quote here from Kelly Slater. Obviously, I'm sure many of you have heard of Kelly Slater, world famous surfer. He said, "I think when a surfer becomes a surfer, it's almost like an obligation to be an environmentalist at the same time." Which is a pretty interesting sentiment from someone who travels regularly around the world, a very jet-setting lifestyle. Any professional athlete will have a significant carbon footprint. So we've kind of got these contradictions that Belinda Wheaton was speaking about before in that quote. But we've particularly seen these issues rising in the winter sports industry, where global warming is definitely already having a major impact. And a case study that I've focused on in some of my research is the work by Jeremy Jones, this professional snowboarder here, an American professional snowboarder who many years ago now started really thinking critically about his role as a professional snowboarder, and looking around at his lifestyle and those of his friends and the community and the industry, and thinking, what is the environmental impact that we're having on the environment that we love and need and our whole industry depends on? And he said, let's be honest, pro snowboarders are fundamentally at odds with the environment. Their globe-trotting ways are pretty damn detrimental to the environment and its increasingly fragile climate. And so he recognised, by looking around, looking at his own lifestyle, that something needed to change. And he was in a position to become a leader in this space. He said, through snowboarding, I started to see more and more the mountains were changing. Something needed to be done. I'd built some great relationships in the snowboard and ski industry, and I felt like our culture needed to come together and slow down climate change. I went back on the idea for a while, because I had a lot of thoughts of, who am I to start this foundation? I'm not an environmental saint. But it was something that wouldn't go away. I went full on into it. And indeed he did, and he set up Protect Our Winters, or POW, which is an outdoor activity recreation organisation that's really trying to rally that whole community, that whole industry to help fight climate change. And they're doing some pretty amazing work, particularly in North America, but also in Europe and other parts of the world. So do check out their website, some of their policy documents, and what we can see here is a collection of people, of leaders, those in these communities coming together in quite unique ways to try to create some change. Here are some of their mission statements. They've partnered up with the climbing community to also get the message out to climbers to think about these issues, which are obviously very timely and political right now. Now, the other point I wanted to talk about was action sports and their role in facilitating recovery. And so my research has really gravitated around this area and this topic for about the last 3, 4, 5 years. And this was greatly facilitated by a grant that I had. It was titled Sport in the Red Zone, Youth in Spaces of Conflict and Disaster. And I had 4 case studies. So 2 were in post-disaster spaces of Christchurch and New Orleans, and 2 were in conflict zones of Gaza and Afghanistan. And I used a multi-method approach using interviews, and digital observations, so really what's going on in the social media spaces, how what are these organisations and groups posting, how are communities responding to that, and broader media analysis. And so through these 4 case studies, I don't have the time to go into all the details today, but I'm very much seeing a lot of creativity by young people in these very difficult environments, these very difficult spaces. So they're engaging in quite a lot of creativity to help create change in their own lives and in their peers and their broader communities. And often young people are sort of presented as victims in these spaces and spaces of development. And I wanted to, in this research, kind of flip that narrative and recognise their agency and their creativity. And actually, what can we learn from young people in these environments when we create space for their voices, for their knowledge? How would that help us do our work differently if we learned from them, recognising they have important knowledge sets that we as policymakers or educators or researchers or development agencies, development workers, what can we learn from them if we recognise them as having really valuable knowledge? How might that change how we actually do our work? How might it change how we approach our work? So through this research, these 4 case studies across 4 years, obviously it was overwhelmingly the physical benefits of these sports for recovery, the psychological benefits, but I was also really focusing in on the social benefits. So that social interactivity of these activities, the connectedness, the community engagement, and a sense of belonging and purpose and hope that the participants really expressed, particularly in their relation to these informal activities of skateboarding, of parkour, of surfing. So in Gaza, some of the young men told me how they learned parkour off the internet. They took to teaching themselves through the internet and then teaching their peers. And they told me convincingly and again how useful it was in helping them just cope with the trauma of their lives. You can see a couple of quotes that illustrate that. And I heard similar things in a very different context in Christchurch in New Zealand after a very significant earthquake. And they told me how surfing or going climbing again really helped them process a lot of stress in their lives and reconnect with their communities. And offered them a way to be proactive when many people around them were feeling very powerless and not able to act or create change around them. And these young people said that by getting out and doing these activities and finding ways to reinterpret the environments around them was a way to help them move on and be proactive, giving them hope. Also, what I saw across these 4 case studies, and this really is summarising too, is a huge amount of sort of community activism, working together as a community to create change, whether it was building their own skate parks, filming themselves, trying to change policy, and I think there's a lot we can learn by paying attention to what's going on by and with young people in these spaces. I was also very interested to see how in each of these locations, in each of those 4 case studies, it was quite overwhelming to see that they're all using social media in ways to share their messages, to build community, to engage with even political purposes, as we see with the young men in Gaza, where they were actually using filming themselves, putting the videos on the internet, sometimes getting hundreds of thousands of views, as a way to raise global awareness about their situation of their lives in Gaza. Another one of the key themes that I've been really focusing in terms of action, sports and development is around gender. And we can connect this very well to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And there's been a lot of work in this space in terms of what does sport offer us here for gender equality and for meeting SDG number 5. And I've been working in this space and have a book under contract at the moment that I'm working on with Dr. Lindsay Hayhurst and Dr. Megan Chewonsky from Canada and the US respectively. And we've been really thinking about working hard to explore issues around women in sport and gender and development. And so that book should be coming out in the next year or so. And my big contribution here is around these action sports for gender development. And again, we can go back to the Action Sports Development website, and we can see that there's a lot of these organisations are focused on girls and women's development. And these are just some of the many examples. And an organisation that I've worked a lot with in a researcher role and over the last 2 or 3 years on the International Advisory Board for is Skateistan, which originally was started in 2007 in Kabul, Afghanistan, by Australian skateboarder Oliver Perkovic. And today, Skateistan is located, it's got 2 facilities in Afghanistan, 1 in South Africa and 1 in Cambodia. And they're reaching thousands of children and youth every week, and around 50% of those participants are girls. So they really have a very strong gender focus in their work. And some of the strategies they use to meet their gender goals are continuing to create a female-first environment. They make real efforts to employ female educators in each of their locations. They host girl-only sessions and girls' days. They let girls skate first at their outreach sessions. They try to work really hard to maintain safe private facilities for girls' participation. And they work with female role models within the communities. This is one of the very early days in Afghanistan with Oliver there. Some more images of the work in Afghanistan. And I'm sure many of you have heard that a documentary that's based on the work they're doing with girls in Kabul recently won both a BAFTA and an Oscar, which I think really is an amazing achievement for this organisation. Obviously for the filmmakers who did a brilliant job, but also the story that is told is the story of Skateistan and what it's doing to support the development of girls in Kabul. But obviously they're also working in Cambodia and South Africa. And when organisations work across locations like this, context becomes very, very important. What are the differences? The cultural, religious differences. And that's where it's really important, and Skateistan does a very good job of working with local staff to help understand those nuances, to make sure they're responsive to and respectful to the communities within which they work. So I do believe in my research signposts that action sports themselves have quite a lot to offer in terms of the areas of gender development. So many of these activities are less connected to long histories of the maleness of particular sports, which can mean there's less resistance from families initially. In contrast to many competitive sports, they often require very little space and resourcing, and thus they can be much more accessible. But obviously creating and maintaining and managing safe spaces for girls is really important and requires consistent and persistent effort. So through action sports, girls can, if these programs are well facilitated, can help girls gain confidence in their bodies through skill acquisition, communication, leadership, and other important social and physical skills. And in some countries, not all for religious and cultural reasons, but in some countries, boys and girls can participate together. And this is really important in helping boys shift some of their ideas and their assumptions around what girls can or cannot do as well. So action sports programs that are focused on girls' empowerment, they're best when they do more than just letting girls do these sports, when they're connected to education and leadership opportunities or understanding health issues. Some of the challenges are around understanding different cultural considerations for girls' participation in action sports or any sports. And so, as I mentioned before, these programs need to work really closely with their communities to understand and respect these differences. got to be really careful not to come into these places and then impose our ideas of what gender equality or gender empowerment is. We need to think really carefully about the strategies to encourage and support girls' participation, ensuring they are safe and supported, and that parents and communities are involved and they understand what the organisation is doing. And again, as I mentioned before, rather than assume Western staff have the skills or resources and knowledge to best run ASDP programs, we need to really consider and develop opportunities for local girls and women to teach, design, manage and lead ASDP programs. And that's one thing I'm really proud of what Skaterstan's been doing over the last decade or so, is really empowering local women and girls in their programs as leaders. And so this is an area that some of my research is focused. These are some of the publications that have come out. One of those is in this book here, on Women in Action Sport Cultures, that I edited with Rebecca Olive. And this is a chapter with Megan Chwanski, The Girl Effect in Action Sports for Development, the case of female practitioners of Skaterstan. I've been very interested in what we can do as researchers to understand the work that's going on behind the scenes. What are the motivations? What are the assumptions? What are the learnings of those that are working in the ASDP sector? And these are a couple of my recent publications. One's in Gender Place Culture around an education-related NGO, and particularly international women staff working there and sort of their embodied experiences in that development sector. And then another paper that's just come out in Third World Quarterly. And again, this one is very interested, and my research more broadly is interested in not just monitoring and evaluating what's being learned or in these programs, but also who is running these programs, who's involved. And what are their experiences of being involved in these programs. And this paper here is focused on risk and how it's interpreted both by local staff and international staff in Afghanistan. Because risk is often quite a very real experience in these types of development contexts, but it's experienced and interpreted in very different ways. And how organisations develop policies around minimising or reducing risk, my argument really is about creating space for the voices of both local and international staff, because their experiences are often quite different, and often quite different to what policymakers might conceive of. So that is a brief whirlwind tour of Action Sports for Development and Peace, what it is, where it's come from. It continues to grow every day. I'm seeing more and more organisations and groups popping up around the world. Some amazing initiatives like Skaterstan's Good Push, which is very much about bringing the skateboarding for development sector together to learn from one another, to develop and share resources. And I think this is only going to grow from there. But we do need to continue to maintain a critical lens, to ask critical questions, to think about context, and there's a lot of research that still needs to happen in this space. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found something of interest today. Do reach out, get in touch via email or Twitter or whatever you might be your preferred platform. But yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and all the best.